Last year, Dr. Donald Miller gave a great presentation at our Chicago conference. I think Don's here today, is he? Where's Don? There you are, sir. And that seated my imagination. And so I proposed to my dear friends here, Hank Whittemore, Katherine Chiljan, and John Hamill, all of whom have given talks in the past on different candidates for the Dark Lady. And then I also prevailed upon my good friend Jeff Falzone over here. Jeff is from the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. You will see his shining face in the box office. But his claim to fame is that he's memorized all 154 sonnets. And he's an Oxfordian who's come to my classes and helped with entertaining our friends and showing them we're pretty cool after all. Jeff will be moderating this session. Each of our three candidates will be presenting a 20-minute presentation followed by 5-minute brief rebuttals by each of them to the others' arguments. Then we'll have a more open question and answer session with Jeff moderating and controlling this. And then at the very end of this, we'll have a 5-minute summation by each of the three proponents here for their candidates. And then we're going to have a ballot. I have ballots here, and every member of this collective is obliged to vote before you go out the exit. I will make sure. And then we'll tally up the votes, and I'm going to ask Bonner Cutting to be the official, ballot counter, because there may be some prejudice among different members of this society, fellowship. And I believe she's a very honest woman. And then tomorrow, we will announce the winner and who we're all to embrace as the new Dark Lady. All right, so, Jeff, you want to say anything? Okay, well, Jeff's going to take over after, he's the timer, the official timer. We'll give him a little leeway. We're not going to be absolute about these time frames, but we have the next 2 hours to actually drill down. This is the first debate we've had since 2003. So it's kind of a new format, it's a new experiment. I hope you like it. I'd like to welcome to the podium Mr. Hank Whittemore.
I want to thank the fellowship for having this debate. Making sense of the sonnets can begin with the realization that these intensely personal lines were set down by the highest-ranking earl at the royal court, and that the beloved younger man is also a member of the court, Earl of Southampton. But finding the story in the sonnets becomes possible only by identifying the woman, the right woman. Even if we knew nothing of the author, it's clear this woman is someone of incredible importance to him. A woman with whom, who wields enormous power over him. A woman with whom he's been involved in a long, complicated relationship. A woman whom he's believed in and defended, even when she's failed to live up to his belief in her. A woman for whom, in the end, he has sacrificed the truth and betrayed himself. I'd like to present evidence that the powerful, dominating woman we call the Dark Lady can only be the same powerful, dominating woman who pervades the lives of both those earls and who pervades so much of Oxford's writing, from his own early Shakespearean sonnet for Queen Elizabeth to his portraits of Venus and the Phoenix, Cleopatra, Titania, Olivia, Portia, Sylvia, Queen Gertrude, and more. His final words to this powerful, deceitful, inscrutable woman sum up their long relationship that has now, in the end, drained his soul and left him in bitter disillusionment. And all my honest faith in thee is lost. I've sworn deep oaths of thy deep kindness, oaths of thy love, thy truth, thy constancy, and to enlighten thee, gave eyes to blindness, or made them swear against the thing they see. For I have sworn thee fair, more perjured I, to swear against the truth, so foul a lie. Has there ever been a more wretched confession of shattered illusion and self-betrayal? Three themes about Queen Elizabeth as Dark Lady. First, context. Identifying the Queen allows us to locate the time frame and historical circumstances for these sonnets, a context every true story must have. Second metaphor, the darkness of the woman is not literal but metaphorical, and the metaphor is inseparable from Elizabeth and her imperial frown. Third, language. Oxford employs the same words to and about the Dark Lady that he's already used to and about the Queen, and used exclusively for her. Context. The overall context is that Oxford desperately wanted the sonnets not only published and eventually read, but also hopefully understood by readers in the future. The sonnets are for all posterity and eyes not yet created, even when tyrants' crests and tombs of brass are spent. So there must be an important story here for us. He's playing the long game, which means the story must transcend all strictly personal issues, no matter how deeply felt. It must involve some major situation to be recorded by English history. And given all we know about Shakespeare, the story must also involve some great issue of his own time. And the most pressing issue was the desperate need for an uncontested and therefore peaceful royal succession. The vital publishing life of Oxford's Shakespeare plays coincides with this growing alarm. What will happen if the Queen dies before naming her successor? The great issuance of Oxford's plays under the Shakespeare name occurred in the final years of her life, right up to her death. The man was still trying to guide and protect her and his country. And the contents of his revised history plays reflect this intensifying crisis. The British author Peter Lake aptly titles his recent book, How Shakespeare Put Politics on the Stage, Power and Succession in the History Plays. His recurring theme is that Shakespeare was using history to raise awareness of the current crisis and ways of dealing with it. Elizabeth's urgent responsibility was to put a successor in place to avoid civil war and even possible takeover by a foreign power. But she could not or would not carry out this responsibility. And finally, the tension boiled over in the Essex Rebellion of early 1601. The rebels began by paying for a special performance of Oxford's play, Richard II, which Elizabeth knew was about her and the possibility of her being deposed and even killed. The earls were hoping to prevent Robert Cecil from further manipulating the Queen to ensure his own survival. Oxford had portrayed Cecil as the hunchback tyrant, Richard III, and now the secretary was terrorizing Elizabeth. They were planning to kill you, and keeping her under his firm control. For Oxford, after a lifetime of service to Queen and country, it was all crashing down with his cunning former brother-in-law maintaining total command of England. As James of Scotland put it, Cecil had made himself king there in effect. Now the context begins to reveal itself. Our goal, in my opinion, has always been to read these autobiographical sonnets to and about the Dark Lady in conjunction with events that must comprise the framework and foundation of Oxford's story. And once we see Elizabeth as this woman, it becomes clear that the story unfolds between the two most important events, the failed rebellion of 1601 and the Queen's death 2 years later in 1603. These moments, destined to be marked by history, are the two bookends. Then, from one to the other, the sonnets and events begin to illuminate each other and to bring the story to life. Begins with Sonnet 127 on that tragic night when most young nobles of Elizabeth's court have been jailed on charges of having plotted against her life. The age of Gloriana has come to an end. It's over. And therefore, the eyes of their sovereign mistress have turned raven black. The ravens have become dread symbols of executions on the Tower Green. When Anne Boleyn was decapitated, it was said that even the ravens of the tower sat silent and immovable on the battlements, gazing eerily at the strange scene, a queen about to die. Now, two former favorites, Essex and Southampton, two former marigolds, are both set to die on that same Tower Green. No wonder the aging queen is in mourning as at a funeral. After the head of Essex is cut off, the beloved fair youth is next, and now his fate is also up to Elizabeth. Hard to imagine Oxford's emotional turmoil over this tragic situation. He might even blame himself. All three of them, Southampton, Oxford, Elizabeth, are suffering. And so Oxford addresses the queen in words echoing those of Christ on the cross. Of him, myself, and thee, I am forsaken. A torment thrice, threefold, thus to be crossed. Now, what other kind of situation would compel this proud nobleman and great author who hated hyperbole to liken his own suffering to that of Christ? Back in 1911, legal expert Edward White declared the Sonnets 133 and 134 clearly refer to the confinement of Southampton in the Tower and express the poet's desire to go his bail by substituting his person for that of his friend in jail. It's Elizabeth who has Southampton in her prison, so Oxford begs her, "Prison my heart, but then my friend's heart, let my poor heart bail. Who keeps me, let my heart be his guard. Thou canst not then use rigor in my jail." In other words, I will not let you execute him in my prison. Water is gone. It's okay. Dr. White also declared the poet proffers to forfeit himself, thank you, Catherine, as security for Southampton. Oxford tells the queen, "So now I have confessed that he is thine, and I myself am mortgaged to thy will. Myself I'll forfeit, so that other mine thou wilt restore to be my comfort still." Now he begs her majesty to relieve his suffering by executing him instead. "Oh, call me not to justify the wrong that thy unkindness lays upon my heart. Kill me outright with looks and rid my pain." An old saying was that monarchs have killing looks. They kill literally with their eyes. Waiting in the Tower, Southampton writes a lengthy poem to the queen, trying to save his life. The only poem written by him we know of. Before Essex was executed, he too had written a poem to Her Majesty while in the Tower. So clearly, poetry was an important means of communicating with the Queen. That makes 3 earls, 3 former royal wards, all writing for Queen Elizabeth in relation to the very same dire circumstances. In Southampton's poem, discovered just several years ago, the Earl reminded Elizabeth, "Only mercy is the prince's own. Only the monarch can deliver mercy." And when she does spare his life, a relieved Oxford responds in Sonnet 145, "Straight in her heart did mercy come." But time to settle the succession is running out, nor does Elizabeth seem to care about the ultimate fate of Southampton, who might well be left to die in the Tower as a condemned traitor in perpetual confinement. So Oxford wails in amazing lines such as these: "Past cure I am, now reason is past care, and frantic mad with evermore unrest. My thoughts and my discourse, as madmen's are, at random from the truth, vainly expressed. His continued loyalty to the Queen stands at complete odds with her failure to name a successor and protect England from chaos and bloodshed. James of Scotland has a blood claim with complications. He's a foreign king, born on foreign soil, technically not qualified, even more deeply unqualified in his character, not to mention that now he's the willing pawn of Robert Cecil. For all that, he does have a claim, but still Elizabeth refuses to name him. In the end, Oxford delivers those final bitter words to the dying female monarch who has always been the most important person in his life. And all my honest faith in thee is lost. And now we can see the metaphor of the Queen's darkness. Oxford established the metaphor in Sonnet 25. Great princes' favorites their fair leaves spread, but as the marigold at the sun's eye, and in themselves their pride lies buried, for at a frown they in their glory die. Elizabeth's favorite courtiers behave like her flower, the marigold, all opening to the warm light of the sun's eye, the sovereign eye, but with just a frown casting her shadow of royal displeasure, their glory dies in darkness. That's the metaphor set forth by Oxford himself, and it's inseparable from Elizabeth. Of the 26 sonnets in this series, only 5 involve her darkness, and each time it's a variation of the same metaphor. In the opening sonnet, after 8 lines, he reports, therefore, my mistress's eyes are raven black. The raven, harbinger of death, her eyes so suited, and they mourners seem, the eyes of mourners at a funeral. It's a metaphor. 130, my mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Well, back in those lines about the marigold, the Queen's eye was the sun. Now, because of her imperial frown and negative view, the sunlight has disappeared. All is dark. How the Queen... There you go. Oh, my God. That's it? Yeah, how the Queen looks at someone or something is also what she does, and in Sonnet 131 he tells her, in nothing art thou black, save in thy deeds. In 132, her eyes have put on black, again in mourning, but if her eyes are already black, why would she have to put it on? Finally, in 147, she's as black as hell, as dark as night. And that's it for the darkness, all metaphor, all tied to the power of the Queen's negative view that turns day into night. And now the language to and about the Queen. For example, I myself am mortgaged to thy will. In a letter to Cecil about the Queen, he promised not to contradict her will. A common saying was that others debate, but the king wills. In 140, she has tongue-tied or silenced him, same as when his art is tongue-tied by authority. Well, the Queen is authority, and she's the only one who can tongue-tie or officially silence him. He writes to her in 149 about being in thy service. He told Burleigh, I have engaged myself so far in her majesty's service to bring truth to light. What other woman has he ever served? Also, he's commanded by the motion of thine eyes. In a private memo, he urged the Queen to give her commandment, and in King John, he wrote about the motion of a kingly eye. In his early sonnet about the Queen, Oxford had blared forth his love and constant truth on her behalf. He was loyal and consistently honest. Now as she nears death, he writes about her side of that commitment. Thy love, thy truth, thy constancy, same three words, but in the end she has no love or truth or constancy. She has betrayed him and England itself, and therefore he has sworn falsely all his life by supporting and praising her. Recall him telling how he has engaged himself in Her Majesty's service to bring truth to light. But now all his honest faith in her is lost. He admits he's had to swear against the truth, so foul a lie. What other woman could force this strong-willed man of high rank, for whom truth was the most sacred value, to swear against it for her sake? Soon after Oxford died the following year, 1604, came the printed full Hamlet. He must have labored to revise and expand this magnum opus right up to his last breath. In the final scene, Fortinbras comes down from the north to rule Denmark amid its royal wreckage, just as Cecil triumphantly brought James down from the north to rule England and its crippled English court. Hamlet bemoans his wounded name and implores Horatio to tell my story. 5 years later, in 1609, the sonnets are published for posterity, and I have no doubt they contain the story Horatio promised to tell the yet unknowing world how these things came about. Here is Edward de Vere's most personal voice, his own story, and the most direct revelation of his authorship. Here is Oxford's cry that his own wounded name be buried where my body is. Here's the truth of the great author at the royal court of England, his devotion to Southampton, his long conflicted relationship with the Queen, his fury and despair over her failure to protect his beloved isle, not to mention her unwillingness to liberate Southampton. Here is his confession of misguided loyalty and self-betrayal for her sake, and his swift disappearance within the black hole of official anonymity. I, once gone, to all the world must die. No, one more. Go back to this lady. I can't do it. Only when Elizabeth is recognized as the powerful Dark Lady will the context, metaphor, and language of the sonnets enable Oxford's untold story to finally come into focus for posterity and for history, for us. Thank you.
Okay. The identity of Shakespeare's Dark Lady has puzzled Orthodox scholars since Shakespeare studies began. But when J.T. Looney identified Shakespeare as the 17th Earl of Oxford, the mystery was over. Who else but Anne Vavasour, the dark-haired lady who captivated Oxford enough to risk his position at court to be with her, and who gave birth to his illegitimate son? In Sonnet 123, Oxford said that he will be honest and true regardless of time, which means that his sonnets are true records of his life. He says, I will be true despite thy scythe and thee. Read the sonnets. Oxford as Shakespeare means that the Dark Lady had these requirements. Number one, the Dark Lady had an affair with him, which happened no later than 1598, as 2 Dark Lady sonnets appeared that year in The Passionate Pilgrim. Number two, here's Oxford, the Dark Lady was much younger than Oxford. In Sonnet 138, he says, thus, speaking of the Dark Lady, thus vainly thinking that she thinks me young, although I know my years be past the best. And the third requirement, oops, what happened?
There's a blacked out button. Oh, there you go.
I just listed the features. Okay, so the third thing is the Dark Lady has dark features, including hair and eyes. And 130, my mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. That means her eyes are not bright, meaning they're not light, therefore they're dark. And if hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. In Sonnet 131, 2 meanings of the word black are applied to the dark lady. Oh, wait a minute, I think. Yeah. Thy black is fairest in my judgment's place. In nothing art thou black, meaning ugly, morally ugly, save in thy deeds, and thence this slander, as I think, proceeds. So you have 2 meanings of the word black applied to the dark ladies. Her black features are the most beautiful, meaning her physical features. Only her conduct is black, meaning ugly. In Sonnet 132, the dark lady's black eyes are like loving mourners, pitying him. So Sonnets 130 to 132 clearly describe her dark physical features, even more so in Sonnet 144, where they are contrasted with the fair youth's fair or light physical features. Which is the last quote. My better angel is a man right fair, my worser spirit a woman colored ill. The fair youth, as the other panelists would agree, was Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton, a fair, red-haired young man. So if you go back to these 3 requirements, Anne Vavasour fulfills them. 2 contemporary portraits of Vavasour depict her as a brunette. One shows her with dark blue eyes, in this one, and another with dark brown eyes. Born circa 1560, Vavasour was approximately 10 years younger than Oxford. It is fact that Vavasour had an affair with Oxford. Oxford was estranged from his wife from 1576, and a few short years later, their affair began. In early 1580, Vavasour was appointed a gentlewoman of Queen Elizabeth's bedchamber, and quickly was promoted as one of her 6 maids of honor. In March 81, Vavasour gave birth to Oxford's illegitimate son. A jealous Queen Elizabeth put Oxford and Vavasour in the Tower of London for their affair. Oxford was released a few months later, but was expelled from the royal court. Oxford reconciled with his wife in December 81, but Vavasour's influence remained. Street brawls erupted between Oxford's men and the men of Vavasour's uncle, Thomas Knivet. This is reminiscent of the street brawls between the Capulets and Montagues in Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare's play about forbidden love. In March 82, Oxford and Knivet dueled, and both were injured. 3 years later, in January 85, Thomas Vavasour, Anne's brother, challenged Oxford to a duel, implying that Oxford was still seeing or was in touch with his sister. This is in January of 85. A direct hint that Vavasour was the dark lady occurs in Sonnet 141. But my 5 wits nor my 5 senses can dissuade one foolish heart from serving thee. Who leaves unswayed the likeness of a man? Thy proud heart's slave and vassal wretch to be. Only my plague thus far I count my pain, that she that makes me sin awards me pain. Vavasour is a feudal law term meaning a vassal or tenant of a baron. So vassal and Vavasour were synonymous. Oxford and Earl is the vassal and heart slave of the dark lady who makes him sin. The sin was adultery. Another characteristic of the dark lady, according to the sonneteer, is her promiscuity. His heart says she is his property, but his head knows that she's the wide world's commonplace. Her will, her sexual appetite, is large and spacious. She ogles other men in his presence. She forswears her lovers and her husband, and has sealed false bonds of love as oft as Oxford. He says to her, those lips of thine that have profaned their scarlet ornaments and sealed false bonds of love as oft as mine, robbed others' beds' revenues of their rents. The record shows that Anne Vavasour had many admirers and was promiscuous. Barely 20 when she came to London, Sir Walter Raleigh wrote a poem to her about her affair with the Earl of Oxford, a married man. And the first line is, many desire but few or none deserve to cut the corn, not subject to the sickle. Anyway. So the point is that many desired Vavasour, Raleigh included. Raleigh's advice to Vavasour was to take heed of fickle Oxford. The advice was apparently written before she had Oxford's child and was imprisoned. In 1583, Lord Burleigh referred to Vavasour as a drab, which is a slut. The Earl of Leicester, as told in Leicester's Commonwealth 1584, famously propositioned Vavasour. He offered Leicester to another of higher place, meaning Vavasour, 100 pound lands by the year, with as many jewels as most women under Her Majesty used in England, which was no mean bait to one that used to traffic in such merchandise, she being but the leavings of another man, meaning Oxford, before him. Vavasour's name was printed in the margin of this book. She is the leavings of another man, meaning Oxford. We don't know if she accepted Leicester's offer. Vavasour was married to Captain John Finch sometime before 1590, but she was not faithful. Circa 1590, Vavasour was seeing Sir Henry Lee, a married man. She gave birth to Lee's child, Thomas Vavasour, alias Freeman, either in 1590 or 1591. This was her second illegitimate child. She lived with Lee thereafter, abandoning Finch, which she probably had done years ago. Interestingly, one of Lee's suits of armor had the initials AV in 4 places. The armor could not have been made later than November 1590, when Lee competed in his last jousting tournament. Lee's wife was still alive at this time. A bit shameless for them both. Lee died in 1611, and by 1618, Vavasour remarried. She evidently did not know that Finch was still alive and was later fined £2,000 for bigamy. The poet's discovery and affair between the dark lady and the fair youth pained him deeply. The dark lady had seduced the fair youth, resulting in a love triangle. The fair youth, as the other panelists would agree, was Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton, a young man of arresting beauty. Circa 1590, Southampton was presented to Queen Elizabeth and was a rising star in her court. In Sonnet 42, Oxford speaks to the fair youth about his liaison with the dark lady. That thou hast her, it is not all my grief, and yet it may be said I loved her dearly. Okay. The point is, that's on the right, on the left, this love triangle can be dated prior to September 93, when Thomas Nash's book, The Unfortunate Traveler, was registered for publication. In Nash's dedication to Southampton, he wrote, "A dear lover and cherisher you are, as well as the lovers of poets, as of poets themselves." Dear lover apparently paraphrased loved her dearly in Sonnet 42. Dear could also be a play on the name Devereux. So Nash is saying that Southampton, the fair youth of the sonnets, is a lover and cherisher of poet Devereux, as well as the lover of Devereux, who is the dark lady. Edition 2 of The Unfortunate Traveler omitted the dedication. Evidently, Southampton had taken offense. Nash's comment about the love triangle means it must have happened in the recent past, otherwise it would not be topical. In June 88, Oxford's wife, Aunt Cecil, died. It is likely that Oxford resumed his affair with Vavasour, resulting in the Dark Lady sonnets. Oxford and Vavasour were certainly tied by their love child, Edward Vere, whom Vavasour was raising. Interestingly, a man named John Finch was Oxford's tenant on property in Sybil Hedingham, a town very near to Oxford's family seat, Hedingham Castle. John Finch, 1 customary messuage or tenement, and 4 acres of land. A messuage or tenement is a dwelling house. If this is Vavasour's John Finch, then she was living with Oxford's child near Hedingham Castle, undoubtedly provided for by Oxford. It would also mean that Finch and Vavasour were married no later than February 85, the date on that document. Sonnet 152 reveals that the Dark Lady was married at the time of her affair with Oxford, and so was Oxford. In loving thee, thou knowest I am forsworn. But thou art twice forsworn to me, my love swearing. In act thy bed vow broke, and new faith torn. Based on Nash's 93 comment about the love triangle, Oxford was referring here to his second marriage, dating Sonnet 152 to post-December 91. If so, then Vavasour was seeing Oxford no more than a year after giving birth to Sir Henry Lee's child and living with Lee. At this time, Lee had 3 residences, 2 country estates, and a leased apartment at the Savoy in the Strand. With Lee's need to be in London as master of the armory, it would not have been impossible for Vavasour to fit in visits with Oxford. Although there's no documentary evidence of an Oxford-Vavasour-Southampton love triangle, it is documented that Vavasour was in a love triangle with Oxford and his wife, Anne Cecil, and with Sir Henry Lee and his wife. Literary evidence also supports Vavasour as the Dark Lady. Many scholars see a close resemblance between the Dark Lady and the character Rosaline in Love's Labour's Lost, and here she's described. A whitely wanton with a velvet brow, with 2 pitch balls stuck in her face for eyes. And by heaven, one that will do the deed, though Argus, which is a 100-eyed giant, were her eunuch and her guard. And I to sigh for her, to watch for her, to pray for her. Go to, it is a plague. Character Barone loves Rosaline and watches for her just as Oxford watched the Dark Lady in Sonnet 148. He says, how can love's eye be true that is so vexed with watching and with tears? Barone also described the love for Rosaline as a plague, the same word Oxford used in Sonnets 138 and 41 about his love for the Dark Lady. Rosaline says, past cure is still past care, which was seemingly lifted from Dark Lady Sonnet 147, past cure I am, now reason is past care. Barone wrote a sonnet for Rosaline, but it was never read in the play. Perhaps it was Sonnet 147. Rosaline has a beauty dark and dark eyes. Barone wishes to swear that black features are beautiful, just as Oxford swore to the same thing in Sonnet 132. Then I will swear beauty herself is black, that I may swear doth beauty lack, if she learn not of her eye to look. Anyway, you can see. With these numerous parallels, Rosaline and the Dark Lady were surely the same person. Rosaline had dark features, just like Vavasour. Rosaline was a lady-in-waiting to a princess, just like Vavasour was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth. And Rosaline is wanton, promiscuous, also characteristic of Vavasour. As noted by the Ogburns in The Star of England, another Dark Lady involved in a love triangle with a fair youth occurred in As You Like It. In a subplot, Shepherd Silvius loves shepherdess Phoebe, but Phoebe loves Ganymede, who is Rosalind disguised as a man. Rosalind Ganymede is twice called fair youth. As poets were often called shepherd during this period, Silvius probably represented a poet, which would be Oxford. The fair youth, who is Rosalind Ganymede, says, I'll sauce Phoebe with bitter words. And bitter sauces occurs in Sonnet 118, where Oxford explains his affair with the Dark Lady to the fair youth. Phoebe says she hates Shepherd Silvius, just as the Dark Lady said she hated Oxford in Sonnet 145 and 149. Shepherd Silvius asks Phoebe to pity me, just like Oxford entreated the Dark Lady in Sonnets 142 and 143. Phoebe is called proud 3 times in one scene. The Dark Lady has a proud heart, as noted in Sonnets 140 and 141. Rosalind Ganymede describes Phoebe as a tyrant, and Shepherd Silvius says he has heard too much of Phoebe's cruelty, words echoed in the first 2 lines of Sonnet 131 about the Dark Lady. He says, thou art as tyrannous, so thou art, as those whose beauties proudly make them cruel. The dark lady has a cruel eye in Sonnet 133. In Sonnet 140, she is told, "Be wise as thou art cruel." And in Sonnet 149, "Canst thou, O cruel, say I love thee not?" Like Rosaline in Love's Labour's Lost, Phoebe and the Dark Lady were apparently based on the same person. And Phoebe has dark hair and eyes, just like the Dark Lady and just like Vavasour. So here's a description as being a proud mistress. Her inky brows, your black silk hair. And then Phoebe complains about Ganymede Rosaline. He said my eyes were black and my hair black, and now remembered scorned at me. So there's another piece of literary evidence too in the Shepherd's Calendar. If the dark wanton Rosaline in Love's Labour's Lost was also the wanton dark lady of Shakespeare's sonnets, then it follows that the wanton Rosalind in Shepherd's Calendar by Edmund Spenser was also the dark lady. How am I doing on time? I'm sorry. Oh dear. In the Shepherd's Calendar, Rosalind is fair lass, meaning beautiful, who had forsaken unfaithfully 3 shepherds, who are the poets, Colin, who is Spenser, Hobbinol, Gabriel Harvey, and the unidentified Menelcas. Rosalind, also called faithless Rosalind, is described as a gentlewoman of no mean house. After Rosalind dumped Colin Spenser, he removed himself out of the north parts and came into the south, meaning Rosalind was from the north. And Vavasour was a gentlewoman of no mean house. She was described as a woman of higher place in Leicester's Commonwealth and was from the north in Yorkshire. Oxfordians believe Love Labour's Lost was performed at court as a masque in January 79, and the Shepherd's Calendar was registered in December 79. Spenser apparently borrowed Rosaline from Shakespeare's comedy, adding a D. I don't know how much time I'm going to go through the rest, but will it be? Oh, okay. It's still not enough time, so. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Well, Willoughby Havisa, with which John is going to talk about too, it's very important to the topic, but let me just skip. This is Willoughby Havisa. Havisa is the lady who has many suitors. And the 5th suitor in this fictional book, which is a satire, probably of highly placed people, and it's a reference to the love triangle. Sorry, I'm skipping here. H.W., being suddenly infected with a contagion of fantastical fit at the first sight of A, pineth a while in secret grief, at length not able any longer to endure the burning heat of so fervent a humor, bewrayeth the secrecy of his disease unto his familiar friend W.S., who not long before had tried the courtesy of like passion and was now newly recovered of the like infection. The point I want to make here is that this is a perfect parallel with the love triangle of the sonnets. So H.W. is Henry Wriothesley, W.S. is William Shakespeare, and A would be the dark lady. And here, they don't say Havisa, they just give an initial, meaning it's the dark lady's name started with the initial A, and Havisa verbally sounds like A. Vavasour. And in addition, in 1596, this is just a quote to say that in the 2nd edition of Willoughby, he said, "If any man therefore by this should take occasion to surmise that the author meant note any woman whose name sounds something like that name, it is too childish, too absurd. So that's, again, another, making us think that, yeah, it must have sounded like her name. But also, sorry, I have a lot more. Finish your sentence. Finish your sentence. I just want to briefly show that the advice poem, in French, avis is advice. So avisa, it could be a reference. And this poem was about Vavasour regarding her affair with Oxford. And one really quick thing that's important, in Penelope's complaint, mentions avisa and calls her Anne. Okay, so I have to end there. Sorry.
So just to say thank you again, I'm honored to be in this panel with two great Oxfordian researchers. So thank you for allowing me to be in the same panel they are. And what's amazing to me is that looking at the same evidence, we come completely different conclusions and interpretations. And that's what makes this fun, because we have to be creative, and maybe eventually we'll find the truth. I'm here to learn. I'm here to follow the evidence, and I've changed my mind before, and I can change my mind again. I have to see where the evidence goes. So let me see if I don't mess this up. So I want to focus at Willoughby's Avisa that Kathy's talking about, and the sonnets, and all the connections, so all the circumstantial evidence, which is quite overwhelming, all points to 1593, 1592. And I made this presentation last year in Chicago, and I made this presentation the year before that in Boston, following what Alexander Waugh did in Ashland. He spoke for an hour and almost 2 hours on this topic. I have 20 minutes. So I'm trying to summarize Alexander's information in 20 minutes, and this is really Alexander's discovery. Okay. So we talked about this already, that she's referred to as a dark lady, because she mentions black or dark in 4 or 5 sonnets, so was she fair or was she dark? That's where you go back to that. But the author makes it clear, "In nothing art thou black save in thy deeds, and thence his slanders, I think, proceeds." So he's making it clear that she is physically fair, just her deeds are black. But why? But she's always black. She's always morally black. Why is that? So was it jealousy? Sonnets 40 through 42 and 133 to 144 speak of how the dark lady created a sexual triangle, which Catherine was mentioning, by seducing his man right fair. So it can be argued from different evidence that both Southampton and Oxford were lovers, they were bisexual. And so this is the nature of the sexual triangle. It's just between the three of them. So the major points in the sonnets, which I think we can all agree, is that the older poet tries to convince a younger, beautiful youth to procreate, not to marry, but to procreate in 17 sonnets, okay? One after another, have a kid, have a son for the love of me. And also it's implying that the fair youth is involved with the poet's mistress, and that there's a scandal going on. To have a scandal going on means that people know about it, okay? So it's not a secret scandal. That's why he says there's vile rumor going on. So what is the scandal? So let's go. Of course, I believe that Penelope Rich was the dark lady, thanks to Alexander Waugh. So who was she? She was the sister of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, and a cousin to the Queen. She was at the highest levels of the aristocracy in England. She became one of the Queen's maids of honor. She married Lord Rich in 1581, by whom she had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children. And then she had her reputation destroyed by 1594 because it was an open scandal that she was having an affair with Charles Blount, Lord Mountjoy, from which she had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 children. Okay, and that was known at court. And the husband knew about that either. He just accepted them and gave him his name. And what was the description of Penelope? Look at that. She had black eyes. The sonnet says she has black eyes. And for black eyes, for the English woman to have black eyes is unique. Vavasour had dark blue or brown eyes. She had black eyes. Her favorite color was black. She dressed in black. She adorned her bedroom in black at Essex House in London. She was referred to by other poets as the Black Lady. Philip Sidney in Astrophil Stella, Black Lady, Eyes and Soul. Sound familiar? And King James in the 1600s said, a fair woman with a black soul. You keep this repeatedly throughout at least 10 years, a fair woman with a black soul. So, and that she was known about that. And here's what she looked like. She was fair with black eyes. That's the best image I could get of her right now, but that's the fuzzy, but you can see she's fair with black eyes. Sonnet 52 the sonnets play on the name Rich, Penelope Rich, at least 14 times. Here's one example. So I am as the rich, whose blessed key can bring him to sweet locked up treasure, to which he will not every house survey, for blunting the fine point of seldom pleasure. So here, he's playing the names of her two lovers in the one sonnet, Rich and Mountjoy, and Blunt. And then here in the very sexual sonnet 135, which is a very powerful sonnet to be referring to the queen, he says, so thou being rich in will, add to thy will one will of mine to make thy large will more. Again, he's punning her name, but in a very sexual sonnet. And then, what else is happening in 1593, 1594 that points to this scandal? Oxford himself in his Venus and Adonis, which he dedicated to Southampton, because in this scenario, he's jealous because of the three-way affair. And so, in the dedication to Southampton, he says, you are the fairest heir of my invention. A lot of people believe this to mean that because this is an invention is the name William Shakespeare. It was the first time that's used. But back then, things had double or triple meaning, so he could have more than one meaning being the first heir of his invention. And the description of Adonis and Venus Adonis is identical to the fair youth. That's been clarified. And then what's Venus and Adonis about? It's about an older woman pursuing a younger man. Sound familiar? And then the line, thou wast begot to get it as thy duty, as in the sonnets, it's encouraging the Adonis to have a child. And then, so Venus and Adonis, so why would Penelope be referred to as Venus? Well, look at the evidence at that time period. She was referred to as Venus at court, at least from 1591 to 1604 by Sidney, Spencer, Sylvester, Breton, Locke, Daniel, Craig. In Penelope's complaint, which Katherine mentioned, she's referred to as Venus. So we have a poem called Venus and Adonis, in which Venus is Penelope and Southampton is Adonis. And then part of the story of Venus and Adonis is that Venus again pursues Adonis. In the hunt, a boar, who is mentioned 17 times by coincidence, gores Adonis in the groin, and from his blood gives birth to a purple and white flower from which Venus cradles. So implication is that a child was born. That's how it can be interpreted. And Alexander Waugh went to great detail, much more detail, to prove that this is the point of Venus and Adonis. And then, so in 1593, 1594 again, which is when all these things were taking place, we have Shakespeare's sonnets, we talk about it. Venus and Adonis, 1593. Rape of Lucrece, which is about a man raping his best friend's wife in 1594. And then we have Edward's Envoy to Narcissus, Nash's Unfortunate Traveler, and the Choosing of Valentines, Barnfield's The Affectionate Shepherd. All I mentioned this three-way affair in 1593-94, and some of that dedicated to Southampton, some are dedicated to Penelope. So we're talking about the same set of people here. And then Willoughby's The Visa, which I'll get on later on, goes into much greater detail about this, and that was also 1594. So everything's pointing to 1593, 1594. These are all linked texts describing the same set of events at the same time. And then more additional dating for the Dark Lady sonnets, a separate book, which also Alexander brought out. The Diella, Certain Sonnets by R.L., published in 1596, okay? And you look at Shakespeare's sonnet 130, which was brought up before, how, my mistress' eyes, or my mistress' skin is snow white. In Diella's sonnets, the author praises this lover one line after line after line, how she's so beautiful and she's so white and whatever. And then Sonnet 130, Shakespeare's Sonnet 130, goes line by line, rebutting everything in the deal of sonnets. And Alexander went this, it was very clear, one after another, everything in that sonnet is a rebuttal to the deal of sonnets. That dates these sonnets to, again, 1593, 94. Who knows when they were written, but they were published in 1596. So not 1600, not 1601, 1594. And then there's some evidence that the RL might be Southampton, which would make sense because if he's dedicating his poems to the Dark Lady, then the author of that poem is Southampton. And then what else is happening in 1593 and 1594? We go back to that. Oxford's son was born in February 1593, but he was desperate to have a child because he had no heir to his earldom, okay? So he needed to have a son. So his wife was pregnant, and was he there for the birth? No. He had no record of him or his wife announcing the birth of the son. He doesn't mention the birth of his son in the sonnets. He remained in London for several months after the birth of his son. He didn't go back. And then curiously in 1600, there's a poem dedicated to Elizabeth Trenton, which is Oxford's wife, in 1600, calling her an immaculate virgin. Why would he call Oxford's wife an immaculate virgin if she had a 7-year-old son? So again, this is something that was known at the time at the highest circles, and so very seldom referred to. So where were they again in 1592, 93 before Henry Vere was born? Penelope was lodging with Southampton at Essex House in London that summer. And that summer, her boyfriend was actually most of that year was in France. And she was estranged from her husband. And she, by coincidence, avoided Christmas court. She would have been very pregnant at Christmas court in 1592, 93. So it's like there's this opening there where she could have been, she was with Southampton most of the time, and she disappeared from court. And the very first sonnet to the Dark Lady, he calls her, accuses her of having a bastard in the very first sonnet of the Dark Lady, and beauty slandered with a bastard shame. In sonnet 143, he calls her a wife who has a child. So she has a bastard child in 1593, 1594. So just based on that evidence, the sonnet evidence and circumstances of their biographies, so Southampton and Penelope, the implication is that the son was no longer, the son of Penelope was the sons of Penelope and Southampton, who became Henry Vere. So there's more. Wait, but there's more. Which we go into Willoughby's Visa now, which Katherine started to talk about. And that was also published when? 1594. And what's the story about? The story retells the ancient myth of Penelope and Ulysses. Hint, hint. Okay? About a chaste and constant wife who is pursued by suitors. And so this is what Visa is about. It's about a chaste wife who is pursued by several suitors. Two identified, as Katherine noted, HW and WS. And most scholars accept that HW is Southampton, WS is Shakespeare, and that this refers to the triangle in the sonnets because it just parallels it. So Willoughby's Visa is very popular. It's a bland and boring poem when you look at it on the surface, but wink, wink, if you know what you're talking about, it becomes interesting. So it went through 5 editions, and then it seems to portray the adultery of a famous woman that was still topical in 1609 when the sonnets were published. That's published in 1635. In 1599, it was banned. The authorities ordered it burnt. Well, they didn't say it was an attack on Queen Elizabeth. They didn't say why it was ordered burnt. But it resurfaced again in 1609. So if it wasn't slandering Queen Elizabeth, some people thought it might be a slander of Queen Elizabeth, so who was the slandering then? It wasn't Queen Elizabeth. Sorry? The book. It was ordered burnt in 1599. Willoughby's Visa. Sorry. So again, many scholars agree that Willoughby parallels not just Lucrece and Venus, but the Dark Lady sonnets. Identifying the Visa, as Katherine knows, would identify the Dark Lady of the Sonnets. And this is the crux. Again, it's not on its own, but seeing all the circumstantial evidence around it, which is all supporting evidence. Again, a visa is a libel. The purpose of a libel is to expose scandalous behavior, not to conceal it. Therefore, the identification of the characters and the message should be clear to some people, some readers at the time, basically people at court. So they go through many clues about who Avisa was. So I don't have time to go through all them because we got 20 minutes. But Avisa was about 30 years old, had been a maid of honor to the queen, and an unhappy marriage for 10 years, all which matched Penelope perfectly. So yeah, and then she was also born in the west of England, which doesn't match Williams was born in London. So I mean many things just don't match. And then the suitor DH, one of the suitors to Avisa, is the only suitor who assigns a name to her in the document, and the name he gives her is Penelope. In calling her husband Ulysses, Avisa is also intimating that her name is Penelope. And then 1596, a new edition of Willoughby's Avisa came out with a new poem. It places Avisa's chastity on trial with Penelope, ruling that Penelope is a whore. Again, this poem confirms that Willoughby's Avisa is a covert attack on a woman called Penelope. It's believed that 1596 edition was quickly suppressed because it may have been too forward about identifying who Avisa was. And then, just like in the Sonnets, in Willoughby's Avisa, there's constant punning in the name Rich. In the poem, English, Victor of English Chastity, a mode appears that states, true chastity is often seen in the poorest than the richest. And then also, that wise Ulysses' constant mate, Penelope, noble birth, her richest boast. I mean, this is over and over and over, these allusions about Penelope being Avisa. And so then, there are Avisa suitors, which have been another big issue as to identify who are the suitors, because that also would identify who Avisa was. And so, one suitor, I can't go through all of them. Again, that should be topical of 1594 when Avisa was published, because that's why people will be interested in it. And identifying them would identify Avisa. And so, one person I have, the second suitor, Caballero, which I made a big presentation last year about this, there is no doubt that Don Antonio Perez, former Secretary of State of Spain, was the second suitor. And he came to England in 1593, and Avisa was published in 1594. He was notorious, and by chance, he was closely related to Essex and Penelope. In fact, he was her guardian at Essex House while Essex was gone. Not her husband, not her lover, but Antonio Perez. And last year I went through how these letters that was written to her by Antonio Perez were very lewd, and so that's why he would be one of the suitors. I mean, that's clear. This is who that second suitor is, and its association with Penelope Rich. The fifth suitor, as Catherine pointed out, people recognize that it's Shakespeare, and there are many clues about that. He mentions a lot of Shakespeare's plays that were still anonymous at the time in his speeches, but more significantly, and Catherine pointed this out to me, that 3 of Oxford's published poems are paraphrased by H.W., pointing out that that means that W.S. is not only Shakespeare, he's Oxford. That makes it that clear. And then the sixth suitor, Catherine pointed out to, is Southampton, and 1/3 of the book, there are like 5 or 6 suitors, 1/3 of the book is just dedicated to Southampton, because the writer wants to make it clear to us, or to the people at the time, that Southampton was the suitor, the most important at the time, which he was in 1594. Again, why focus so much of the libel on Southampton? He was her confidant. He could not marry her because she was already married. He married her cousin, and he named his first daughter Penelope. And finally, at the end of Willoughby's Avisa, his final words are, "In opere me copia fecit, riches make me poor." Again, punning the name Rich from Penelope Rich. And then More important than all of this, more circumstantial evidence, shocking news. Passages in the Southampton's courtship of Vavasour describe a woman who brought forth a man-child, a woman who was with child by whoredom, and a man who stole his neighbor's wife. Sound familiar? So Willoughby clearly identifies Southampton as HW, and Southampton might be the father then of Henry Vere. And the cover to Willoughby's Vavasour, which Katherine had a chance to go through, it shows the antlers and the horns of somebody who's being cuckolded. So it's about somebody being cuckolded, and talking about then the meaning. That's the main thrust of the book. So again, going back to Venus and Adonis, the dedication is, but the first heir of my invention proved deformed. I should be so sorry I have so noble a godfather. So again, a double meaning here, not just as the first time he uses the name William Shakespeare, it's also that he's the father of his son. And then another nail in the coffin, Penelope's complaint, which Katherine brought up. 1596, a second libel is stating that Penelope is the chaste woman and that Vavasour is a whore. The pamphlet described Vavasour as being poor and Penelope as being rich and having titles. Why even bring up Penelope's complaint if people thought that that wasn't that wasn't the woman being accused? And then just the conclusion is he was Penelope, the dark lady in Vavasour. All these affairs with 1593, 94 suggest that. And then that the final nail in the coffin is the portraits of Henry Vere and Southampton. At first I thought they're so similar that one was, could show that Southampton was the father of Vere, was actually, it's the same person. Yeah, it's the same person. And Alexander Wall made a strong presentation of this in Ashland, how the hair, the eyes, it's the same person, but he's being called Henry Vere, and one of the ones called Henry Wriothesley, showing that one's the father of the other. And to make it even more clear, this is my final slide. He's showing this full portrait of Henry Vere, which is actually a portrait of Southampton, but showing Henry Vere's name. And he's holding the baton sinister, which was not exclusive, but a typical way to portray bastardy back then. The sons of Charles II, the bastard sons, were shown portraying that, the same baton sinister. So here we have a case where people knew that Southampton's son, that Oxford's son was Southampton's son, showing in public that he's a bastard of Southampton. So that's my evidence.
So now we're going to be doing, each person gets 5 minutes to rebut the other two. We'll start with Hank.
Are we ready? Okay. I don't know where to begin. Obviously, I've just listened to two dark ladies, and I had many thoughts. Some more amusing than serious. I mean, we just listened to a very busy Southampton. He was the lover of Oxford. He had an affair with Oxford's private secret lover, Vavasour. He then had an affair with Oxford's Penelope, and I'm not sure how it all goes anymore, except a baby was brought to to Hackney on the doorstep, and somebody rang the bell, and Elizabeth Trentham came out and said, "Oh, my baby." And Oxford said, Elizabeth, we're good. That's just a humor. When Alexander Waugh presented Penelope Rich in Ashland, he collared me after we watched Pericles, a wonderful show. And he said, could we go out and have shots? I said, we're going to shoot each other? He said, no, we're going to have vodka shots. And I tried to say to him that, for me, what he was telling us was, I'm not an electrician at all, and if you open the back of a radio, I'm going to see a lot of wires, each connecting over here and here and here. I said, I'd like you to sometime turn around the radio and turn it on so I can hear the story and the real thing. We've wandered into many different literary universes in these two talks. The main one I think we've wandered into is Willoughby as a Visa. Penelope's complaint is apparently an allegory, but I don't think in allegory you use the name of the real person. Otherwise, Venus and Adonis would be about Venus. We've also wandered into other sonnets of the fair youth sonnets. And I was trying to hold myself to the 26 of the Dark Lady. Now, in those fair youth sonnets, a couple of things. One, Oxford deliberately, and of course he would have to if he's the author, used Elizabeth's motto, as she herself wrote Semper Idem in English, ever the same. And he did write, why write I still all one, ever the same? In effect saying, this is what I write about all the time. And in 107, it's generally acknowledged that that is 1603, a little different than 1594, or even 1599. It's the Queen's death and Southampton's liberation from the Tower by King James. And even our founder, Mr. Looney, was concluded that Sonnet 125 about the canopy was indeed about Elizabeth's funeral. But those are three sonnets that have Elizabeth almost directly in them. So the sonnets are steeped in Elizabeth, and so are the two final Bath sonnets, in which the author, Oxford, accompanies his mistress, his sovereign mistress, to Bath. And as George Greenwood said, I'm sure Shakespeare didn't accompany her to Bath, but I'm sure it was a member of the royal court. And he was referring to Elizabeth. So there we have Elizabeth again. Willoughby as a Visa, I'd love to have a debate about it, because we had a wonderful researcher here named Barb Fluiz. Roger, remember her, some of us, she did this tremendous work on Roger's own work with the Geneva Bible, and she was very cautious. She never said anything directly. I hear a noise. And what she did say was that Oxford wrote, in her unequivocal, that Oxford wrote Willoughby as a Visa. So we could have a whole debate about Willoughby as a Visa. And why is he so angry at the lady who bore his child, John? That's what I would like to know. Why he's so darn angry when Penelope, in the middle of having 5 kids and 6 kids, or 6 and 5, had this other one. I mean, come on. And now he's calling her black as hell, as dark as night, which can't be about her eyes anymore, brown, black, or blue. So there's a number of other things here. I'm going to run out of time, but we can get back to it. Thank you.
I just have notes here. I don't have a prepared statement, but I would say that Queen Elizabeth is disqualified because in at least one sonnet she is described as having dark hair. Queen Elizabeth was redhead, and even in, I think it was the same sonnet, the Dark Lady's darkness is contrasted against the fair youth's lightness, and that's about physical features. In Sonnet 152, it's shown that the Dark Lady is a married woman, and Elizabeth was never married. And also another sonnet, he refers to himself being older than the Dark Lady, and Queen Elizabeth was older than Oxford. I believe, like Hank, that Southampton was the Queen's child, and it makes me wonder, well, how can there be a love triangle? And I do believe that the other sonnets are about this succession, but the Dark Lady sonnets is about, lust, his lust for this woman who constantly is beguiling him, and then when she has an affair with, the person the man that he loves, it's so deeply, deeply painful. What else? And, going back to Avisa, which we all, well, I don't know about Hank, but John and I believe that she was the Dark Lady. And her name began with an A, not E. And she was a lady in waiting, Avisa, and Queen Elizabeth was the queen, not a lady in waiting. And as I mentioned at the very end, that in Penelope's complaint, talked about Avisa, and her name was Anne, okay? So that's what I'd say about that. As far as Penelope, again, I would, repeat that she did have dark hair. That was described, and Penelope in that one photo it looked like blonde or red hair. And also wearing black, that's very interesting, but it wasn't descriptive of the Dark Lady. It didn't say she wore black, just only that she had black features and she was morally black. There's also no historical evidence, like Vavasour, that Oxford had an affair with Penelope. Or even, they probably were acquainted, but any other sort of intimate relationship is not known, as far as I know. He didn't bring it up, or I missed it. And also, I would say the Dark Lady wasn't as promiscuous. Penelope wasn't as promiscuous as the Dark Lady. She was married, right? And she had a lover, but that was it, as far as I know. I think Philip Sidney was inspired by her because he was almost engaged to her, I believe, and maybe really deeply loved her, but don't know if they had an affair. Yeah, as I mentioned before, the Avisa lady, her name starts with A, and she was identified as Anne, so that would not apply to Penelope. Also, John brought up Venus and Adonis and being about the Dark Lady, and I don't see any evidence of that, honestly. And also, the Dark Lady sonnets are not about procreation. It's just not in there. So anyway, and also he brought up a baton being a sign of bastardy. I'm sorry I don't have the image, but I came across an image of an earl, a Jacobean earl, and he had the same armor with a baton, and he was not a bastard. At some point I can get back to John and send it to him, but there are other examples where it does not represent a bastard. So that's all I have to say.
Well, thank you, Catherine and Hank. I just want to reemphasize some of my points. The sonnets say, "And nothing out are dark except in thy deeds." So then he goes and talks about her dark eyes and her dark hair. So it's hard to interpret all that. And again, to me, that about the portraits of Southampton and Henry Vere, with Henry Vere being listed as Southampton's portrait being listed as Henry Vere, that's clear he's being portrayed as a bastard of Southampton. And you can look up on Wikipedia that the common way to portray bastardy was the baton sinister. Not always, but a very common way. And the king's sons, Charles II's sons, the bastards, that's how they were portrayed. And people knew they were bastards. So it wasn't exclusive, you're right. There's some examples, but you can look at the book and it said that was the common way to portray bastardy. And when you have that portrait of Southampton and Henry Vere, which is the same person with two different names, to me that's just a nail in the coffin. And again, the dating of the sonnets, everything happened, this three-way affair, all the documentation shows the 1593, 1594 from different authors, including Shakespeare himself, and then the Diella sonnets, published in 1596, all point that when the sonnets were written, not 1600, because we had evidence that with the yellow sonnets that were at least published 1596, so that pushed it back at least a year or two. So those are, I mean, so those are the main things I have. The evidence, I think, is just overwhelming. I have a lot more evidence that Alexander brought up, which I left out, from different authors and different, it's all wink, wink, what's happening back then. But once you know what that was talking about, then you say, oh, that's what that means. Oh, that's what that means. Oh, that's what that means. But we have, against the portraits, why would Oxford accept Southampton as his son? Oxford wanted a son to be his heir. He needed an heir to continue the earlship, okay? And so I believe that he was, obviously, the sonnets say that he was in an affair with the Dark Lady, who, if it's Penelope, that's who the mother was, and we know Southampton, Penelope had a very strong relationship, and so that it all makes sense that Oxford was pushing Southampton to have a child by Penelope, because Southampton seems to have been in love with Penelope, and that they could not have an affair legally because she was already married, and so who knows what was going on. But why would Oxford's wife accept that child? Because I asked Alexander Watt that question. She said, well, for some reason, maybe she could not have a child, and that was the arrangement that they did together to have a child to continue the earlship. So what, I mean, the other people have arrangements like that at the time, and Alexander Watt explained that also in his examples. So it was not unique. It was other situations like that did occur, very rare. But the sonnets imply that there was a three-way affair between Southampton, the Dark Lady, and Oxford, and then all this other evidence at the time point from different authors about a three-way affair dedicated to Southampton, dedicated to Penelope, and even Shakespeare himself in his poetry. And again, Venus was associated with Penelope. I mentioned all these authors at the time who referred to Penelope as Venus. So that's why it would imply Venus and Adonis as a wink, wink. This is a relationship that's going on again between them. So that's really, I just regurgitated what I mentioned before. Okay, thank you.
Does the Dark Lady have to be one person?
Does the Dark Lady have to be one person? Yes.
Yes?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, my question is for all three of you is, was the publication of these sonnets truly dangerous? And if so, I have a hard time seeing either Vavasour or Penelope as being that dangerous, but I do see Elizabeth being dangerous.
I see them as terribly dangerous. They're part of what would turn our students on that we're going to go reach out to, is that this author was speaking truth to power, and therefore they were dangerous.
I agree with Hank. They were terribly dangerous, but it wasn't the Dark Lady portion that was the dangerous part. It was the revelation that Queen Elizabeth had a child by, Oxford. Yes.
And I agree that we're dangerous, but again, for a separate reason, because Southampton and the Devereux were very powerful nobility in England who were intermarry with everybody else. So it would be such a scandal, a vile scandal that ruined the reputations of everybody if they knew that what was going on, that Henry Wriothesley was actually a bastard of Oxford. So that all the most powerful and richest families in England would have been involved in this scandal. That's why it was dangerous, not for political reasons, but for societal reasons, inheritance reasons.
Each of you did an excellent job, and I mean it. But the only one who gave any hint of having looked beyond England, beyond the Queen's social network, and the international poetics was Catherine. She mentioned Spenser, right there she had my vote. because Spenser was notorious for borrowing from the French poets who each had their dark ladies. He actually translated from Du Bellay, who had a series of sonnets in which he compared his mistress's hair to wires. And I just think that we're being extremely narrow to look for biographical detail in sonnets that may well have been describing multiple women, multiple examples from abroad, because Oxford was an internationalist.
I didn't hear a question in that, but interesting information.
Yeah, this just outstanding performances and advocacy by each of you. This is better than any moot court argument I've ever seen. So, and if I'm ever on trial, I want you to be my defense attorney. You did a great job and passionate. My question is mainly for John, because on the evidence, honestly, I've tended to think that Alexander's theory is intriguing and has some support, and I think John's argument seems powerful evidentially. However, there's the one point that Hank raised, which I'm having trouble with, if Edward de Vere essentially procured this affair between Penelope and Southampton to produce an heir that he desperately needed, then why the rage about the betrayal? Why is this black as hell as night? Why is he raging at this woman for betraying him when in fact she's done him a service? That's strange, and that is something that does give me pause, because I take Hank's argument to be that there's a grandeur here of betrayal, which from Hank's standpoint I think only befits the queen. I thought, Katherine, you also made some very powerful points. You've convinced me that to put at least Anne Vavasour back on the playing field is a possibility, which I had almost dismissed. So I want to give credit to all three of you for making really troublingly powerful arguments.
Yeah. Love is strange. So he provided a very strong love-hate relationship with Penelope. And so obviously he was jealous of the affair. That's why it's Venus and Adonis and Rape of Lucrece, shows and dedicated to Southampton, okay? So, and then the sonnets show, in those things, he's accusing one of Southampton of raping Penelope, and the other one of Venus Adonis of Penelope pursuing Southampton. So it's the flip version. Yeah, it's a contradiction. So then he wanted a child, and then he was in love with Penelope, but then maybe Penelope and Southampton fell in love. Then he got upset about that. So we don't know the details, and we'll never know the details. But it's a very complex situation. I agree.
Just a comment, actually, in response to the gentleman who was saying, well, would this be dangerous? What I can tell you as a book collector, there's only one copy of, I believe, The Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis. I can't remember which one, but there's only like one copy of each of those. I think they're both in the British Library. There's only like 8 or 9 copies of the first edition of the Sonnets. And then you were just saying in one of the earlier talks just now that Avisa was suppressed and copies were destroyed. So obviously all 3 of these, or 4 of these works were considered to be somehow subversive. This is low surviving copies even by standards. There are many more copies of other books that survive from the period.
Is this on? There's a great book called The Queen Declined by, her last name is DeLuna. And is the mic off? It's on. Okay, so she concludes very passionately that Avisa is Elizabeth. And that's the first mention of Shakespeare outside the name on the 2 plays. I might add, by the way, Venus and Adonis was early written in the 1570s. That's where that originated, and then it may have been revised. but it was still, all the evidence is that. But Visa has the same motto as Elizabeth. Instead of ever the same, it's always the same. The final three words of Willoughby as a Visa as a signature are ever or never. And it's about Troilus and Cressida, which is a very interesting poem. I recommend everybody read it at the end. It's a brilliant poem. It looks to be like by Oxford. And many other aspects of De Luna's work that even the Riverside has accepted it, by the way. And so I think it comports. I think 1594, as John says, very crucial year. I think it all hit at once. The idea that now the Queen has reached her climacteric year, and 63, and it's coming up, and she hasn't named a successor, and you have an amazing spat of outpouring of writing by the writers. And I can name them all, but for example, the Phoenix Nest, which is obviously the Queen's throne, in which Oxford has a signed poem there entirely to Elizabeth, Cynthia, and so forth. And that's where that poem first appears. So it's all of a piece.
Okay.
And as a succession issue.
I'd like to first congratulate the three of you for agreeing to participate in this debate. And this entire room for doing so with civility. How can we chide Stratfordians for refusing to debate us if we're not willing to debate within our own room? So there's something that I think we should do at least once every year. At every conference, there should be at least one debate on one topic. That being said, I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but I happen to believe that Southampton is the child of Elizabeth and Edward. And so that would make, if John is correct, Henry Vere Edward's legitimate grandson, even though he would be illegitimate, which would make total sense for him to then be the 18th Earl of Oxford. But my question to you, John, is with regards to the portraits, is it possible, if we're correct, that Southampton is Edward's son, that quote-unquote mistake of Henry Wriothesley being depicted as Henry Vere is actually somebody trying to tell us that the Earl of Southampton is the bastard of Edward de Vere?
You know, we can. That's a great thing about this discussion. We can go any which way we want to, but I see no evidence at all that Oxford was the son of the Queen or that Southampton was his son at all. And that's a different discussion, and that wasn't discussed here. So I can't answer that question because I don't believe that. But because you would have to show me evidence as to why that's the case. What I do know, and I'll say this again, the portrait shows Henry Vere as Southampton, but with Henry Vere's name, with the baton sinister. That's a very powerful conclusion, and that's going to be my conclusion. Again, you may deny his Southampton's son, but why does that portrait exist? To me, that's the nail in the coffin.
Why, John, why would they want to advertise that they're a bastard? That doesn't make sense to me.
I'm saying it was because a lot of people knew that at the time, and so that's. I know, but that's a very rare print, and I don't know how that came about or why that was done, but it does exist. You can't deny that it does exist.
I don't know why we think they're all the same, these sonnets. I think some of them are about the Dark Lady as a mistress, and I would buy Penelope Rich for that. And I think other ones sound like they're about the succession and Queen Elizabeth. So I want to vote for Hank and John, actually. I'm sorry, Catherine. Because I think some of them Edward de Vere is perfectly capable of thinking of two things at once. So he might be writing about a lover or a love triangle at the same time as putting in something about the Queen and the succession. And one of the ones, 152, part of it sounds much more like the succession story, and part of it is clearly much more sexual. So I think, without my happening to believe that Elizabeth I and I don't believe in that PT2 theory, but even without that, I think there's mixed metaphors and mixed ideas in these sonnets, and that some of them are different, and some are more like what Hank says, and some are more like what John Hamill says. That's my view.
But can I just briefly say that in Sonnet 152...
My question is, how do you explain the appearance, the actual painting, a colored painting of Henry Devereux, who has these really dark eyes and who looks remarkably like Anthony Viscount Brown, who would have been his grandfather had Penelope Rich been, or Southampton been the father, and Penelope Rich been the mother. You have to look about the eyes. You have these fair-haired people. What do you think about that? The eye coloring of Trenton, the fair-haired, very fair-haired, and then you have Mary Gold, Penelope, who married Rich.
Was that a question or?
Yeah, about eyes. What do you think? What do you think about the eye color? Doesn't that affect your thinking about how we have this? Look at that picture of Henry Devereux. He's a big, chubby guy with dark black eyes.
You'll get the last question. You'll get the last question.
I don't know. What are you driving at? Sorry. Yeah.
Actually, because I should have brought this before, there are many portraits of Henry Vere, okay? And none of them look like that portrait that he looks like Southampton. That's the only portrait of Henry Vere where he looks exactly like Southampton. All the other portraits of Henry Vere, maybe like another 10 of them, looks like a completely different person with black eyes. And so that's what's anomaly, that this one portrait of Henry Vere, this the only one that exists, shows him being Southampton.
I think we have to...
Here's the last one.
Okay.
I understand I am the last question. And I want you to know, don't mark your ballots until you hear this. As an evidentiary issue, the question is, who is the Dark Lady of the Sonnets? The pretensive justification is provided from within the sonnets, and no exterior information is needed or required. And obviously, the answer is the Dark Lady, Queen Elizabeth.
Okay. All right. That was a vote.
Okay, so I'm going to start responding to Bill Camarino. Thank you for your comment. And that I want to look at the evidence, not just in the sonnets, but the whole historical perspective. What's happening in the world around them. You cannot look at things in a vacuum. You have to see what else is going on, what else are people saying, what else is being written, what other portraits are there done. And again, I'm going to emphasize, which I said like 10 times now, that portrait of Southampton being Henry Vere is very powerful, being the bastard son of Henry Vere. So I mean, you cannot get around that. And all the evidence shows that this was happening in 1593, 1594. Maybe Venus and Adonis may have been, a version may have been written earlier, but it was printed in 1594. It may have been modified to reflect that affair in 1594. So all these things were happening in 1594. Nobody's listening to me, but he's talking over there. So anyway, so that's what I have to say. That's a different question. That's a different question.
Okay, I'm just going to give my conclusion that I wasn't able to give. I'm first going to address that one lady in the back who was talking about Sonnet 152. It's clearly she is a married lady in Sonnet 152. Could not be Queen Elizabeth. Okay. The facts show that Anne Vavasour was certainly one of the major loves of Oxford's life, even though this love caused him physical injury and public disgrace. This makes her instantly eligible as Oxford's Dark Lady of the Sonnets. Vavasour fits the Dark Lady's physical description, having dark features and being younger than the poet. Vavasour, like the Dark Lady, was a sexual libertine, birthing 2 illegitimate children. One while she was married to someone else, and later in life she was fined as a bigamist. The Dark Lady turned up as characters in 2 Shakespeare plays, Rosalind in Love's Labour's Lost and Phoebe in As You Like It. Both had dark physical features like Vavasour. Yorkshire lass Vavasour also fits Rosalind in Spenser's Shepherd's Calendar, a faithless wanton from the North Country. These two plays, however, were written initially in the late 1570s. Thomas Nash's reference to the love triangle of the sonnet dates it to the early 90s. It's not unlikely that Oxford had resumed his affair with femme fatale Vavasour after his wife's death in 1588. Their child, Edward Vere, was another excuse for them to keep in contact. A. Vavasour also fits the character A. Visa, the subject of Willoughby's Visa, a poetical satire that specifically targeted Shakespeare and the love triangle of the sonnets. Avisa was openly identified as Anne in another satire, Penelope's Complaint, which accused Avisa Anne of seeking titles and enticing dowries. Circa 1590, Vavasour received a £60 annuity from Sir Henry Lee. Avisa's name was probably inspired by Sir Walter Raleigh's poem, The Device, which was addressed to Vavasour about Oxford. Avis is French for advice. If Anne Vavasour was a dark lady, then she was in a love triangle with Oxford and her husband Finch, a love quadrangle with Oxford, Finch, and Henry Lee, and a love quintuple with Oxford, Finch, Lee, and Southampton. What a woman. Vavasour had quite a life and is certainly worthy of much more documentary evidence. Research. Who knows? New letters and sonnets written by Oxford could be found. And I would just add that the Dark Lady Sonnets was about being deeply, deeply pained by a woman that he was sexually attracted to. It's not about the succession, although other sonnets are about the succession, but not the Dark Lady Sonnets. And the Dark Lady Sonnets are not about procreation.
Well, this is poetry. It's not essays, 26 essays. So we talk about hair coloring and eye coloring, and we talk about love triangles. Spenser, Ron mentioned Spenser. Yes, he wrote The Fairy Queen about Elizabeth. Spenser even wrote, for example, I rise and fall, courtiers as the tide do rise and fall. He met Elizabethan courtiers, and he was using a sexual image of the male, which may have been locker room talk among those courtiers, rising and falling, the male sex organ, rising and falling in front of the queen. And so did Oxford in the Dark Lady Sonnets. He wrote, for thyself, I stand in thy affairs, fall in thy side, by thy side. Same thing. The standing in the affairs could be looked upon as in your love affairs. I agree. I agree. It's poetry. But I believe he was talking about affairs of state, and that you can look at Spenser talking the same language about Elizabeth, and that's poetry also. Now, Duncan Jones says that she has no doubt internal and external reference points to 1603 and 04 as initiating an intense period of writing and perhaps revising, which may have continued on and off for the next few years. That's time frame we're talking about here. And I have no doubt the first 26 sonnets were written to reflect the 1590s, so I'm not out of that ballpark. But life did go on. And for example, the expensive spirit in Sonnet 129. I know it could be taken as a masturbatory sonnet. It could be taken a whole lot of things. I'm not naive about it. But you even look at Booth, and he says spirit. The first gloss on that is energy, vigor, ardor, life force, as full of spirit, physical and mental energy. And if you look at the sonnet carefully, it's all about one thing on the surface, but underneath is a great power to it. And I submit it wouldn't have such power if it were not poetry and it was just stated. And it looks like a love triangle and so on. I just feel that I came here to talk about the Dark Lady, the identity of her, and that I was using those sonnets because I can do it. I can show you, if I had 3 hours, each sonnet and how it illuminates the actual evidence of history. Everything I talked about was a fact, was a historical fact, not did Penelope have an affair with so-and-so, and did so-and-so, did Southampton have an affair? Goodness sake, he was going to get married to, I don't know. It could all be true, but I'm speaking of facts, historical facts that took place. There was a trial, a rebellion, a trial. There was an execution. There was a release of Southampton from the Tower. There was a funeral of the Queen, and it relates to these sonnets. No, the Dark Lady series wouldn't cover the funeral of Elizabeth. Why? Because the sonnets went on past her funeral and past the release of Southampton and her death. And then they marched stately and you read those sonnets, 19 sonnets for 19 days, from 107 to 125, the Queen's funeral. The reign is over, the succession is taken place, the dynasty is over, and Oxford is about to retire and disappear from court after getting what he needs to keep his affairs in order, and then he literally disappears quite soon.